My sister Celestine disappeared 3 years ago without a trace, but what I found in that rusted yellow school bus deep in Millbrook Forest changed everything I thought I knew about her final days. I'm Valora Chen, and for the longest time, I believed my sister was just another runaway statistic. I was wrong about everything. The police told me Celestine left on her own. They said 19-year-old girls do this all the time, especially ones struggling with depression after dropping out of college. They painted this picture of a troubled kid who couldn't handle life anymore, who just packed up and walked away from everything she knew. But I knew something they didn't. My sister would never leave without saying goodbye to our grandmother Naya. Never. These two had this incredible bond that went beyond anything I'd ever seen. When Celestine was having her darkest days, when she couldn't even get out of bed, she'd still drag herself across town just to sit with Naya and listen to her stories about the old days. Naya was the only person who could reach Celestine when the rest of us couldn't get through. See, Celestine wasn't just dealing with regular college stress. She'd always been the adventurous one, the one who climbed too high, stayed out too late, and asked too many questions about places we weren't supposed to go. But after she dropped out of school, something shifted in her. The adventure-seeking turned into something darker, like she was searching for something she couldn't name. I was living in Portland then, building my career as a forensic photographer, telling myself I was helping people by documenting crime scenes and accidents. But really, I was running away from my family's problems. Every time Mom called crying about Celestine's latest episode, every time Naya gently suggested I come home for a visit, I found another excuse to stay away. I thought I was being practical, responsible even. I had no idea I was abandoning my sister when she needed me most. The day Celestine disappeared, she'd seemed better. Mom said she'd actually smiled at breakfast, talked about maybe taking some photography classes, even mentioned wanting to learn more about our family history from Naya. It was the first hopeful conversation they'd had in months. Then she kissed Mom goodbye, said she was going for a walk to clear her head, and vanished. The search parties found nothing. Her car was still in the driveway. Her purse, her phone, even her favorite jacket were all still in her room. It was like she'd simply evaporated into thin air, leaving behind only questions and the devastating silence of a family torn apart by not knowing. For 3 years I carried this crushing weight of guilt and unanswered questions. 3 years of wondering if I could have prevented it somehow, if being a better sister might have made the difference. 3 years of avoiding Millbrook because every street corner, every familiar face reminded me of my failure to protect the person I loved most in the world. But last month, when Naya passed away peacefully in her sleep, I had no choice but to come home. Someone had to handle her estate, and despite everything, I was still the responsible one, the one with the steady job and the practical mind. What I didn't expect was that Naya, even in death, would give me the key to finding out what really happened to Celestine. Because hidden in that attic, tucked away in Naya's hiking journal, was an entry that changed everything. An entry that mentioned Celestine, an old school bus, and a warning about places that hold too much pain. That's when I realized that maybe, just maybe, my sister hadn't run away at all. Maybe she'd been trying to tell us something, and we just hadn't known how to listen. Walking back into Naya's house after 3 years felt like stepping into a museum of my own guilt. Everything was exactly as I remembered it, from the hand-carved wooden birds on the mantel to the faded quilt draped over her favorite reading chair. The smell of lavender and old books still lingered in the air, but without Naya's warm presence filling the rooms, the house felt hollow, like a shell of all the love and laughter it used to hold. I'd been putting off this trip for weeks. After the funeral, finding excuse after excuse to delay the inevitable. My job at the Portland Crime Lab was demanding, I told myself. I had important cases that needed my attention. But the truth was, I was terrified of facing all the memories that lived in these walls. Memories of lazy Sunday afternoons when Celestine and I would curl up on either side of Naya while she told us stories about her childhood in Taiwan. Memories of holiday dinners where Celestine would make everyone laugh with her terrible impressions of our relatives. Memories of the last Christmas we were all together, just months before everything fell apart. The guilt hit me hardest in Celestine's old bedroom. Mom had left it exactly as it was the day she disappeared, like some kind of shrine to hope that Maybe she'd come walking back through that door. Her art supplies were still scattered across the desk, a half-finished charcoal drawing of Naya's garden pinned to the wall. Her bed was still unmade, the covers thrown back like she'd just gotten up to brush her teeth and would be right back. I sat on the edge of that bed and finally let myself remember the last real conversation Celestine and I had. It was over video chat about 6 months before she disappeared. She'd called me late one night, crying about something that had happened in her psychology class, some discussion about trauma that had triggered memories she couldn't handle. I was tired from a long day processing evidence from a car accident, and instead of really listening, I'd given her some generic advice about talking to her professors and getting proper help. "You don't get it, Vel," she'd said, her voice small and broken. "You've always been the strong one. You see horrible things every day and just compartmentalize them. I can't do that. Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in other people's pain, and I don't know how to make it stop." I should have driven down that night. I should have taken time off work and stayed with her until she felt stable again. Instead, I told her she was stronger than she knew and that everything would look better in the morning. Then I hung up and went to bed thinking I'd call her back the next day when I had more time to talk properly. But work got crazy, and days turned into weeks, and by the time I thought to reach out again, she was already pulling away from everyone. That's the thing about being a forensic photographer. You spend your days documenting other people's worst moments, thinking you understand tragedy because you've seen it through a camera lens. But seeing trauma and living with it are completely different things. I could analyze blood spatter patterns and reconstruct accident scenes with clinical precision, but I couldn't recognize that my own sister was struggling with something far deeper than ordinary college stress. Naya tried to warn me, of course. She had this gentle way of expressing concern without making you feel attacked. "Celestine seems very interested in sad stories lately," she'd mentioned during one of our phone calls. "She asks me about the old tragedies in town, about the people who got lost in the woods. I think perhaps she's trying to understand her own sadness by learning about others." At the time, I dismissed it as just Celestine being her usual curious self. She'd always been drawn to mysteries and local legends, the kind of stories that gave other kids nightmares but fascinated her. I figured it was just her way of processing her depression, maybe even a good sign that she was engaging with something outside her own problems. But as I sat in that empty house surrounded by boxes of Naya's belongings, I started to see the pattern I'd missed. All those late-night calls from Mom about Celestine asking strange questions. All those times Celestine had specifically asked about hiking trails and old stories. All those conversations with Naya about places in the forest that held dark histories. The attic was the hardest room to face. This is where Naya kept all her treasures, the things that mattered most to her. Photo albums chronicling 4 generations of our family, letters from relatives still living in Taiwan, and her hiking journals, dozens of them, documenting every trail she'd explored in 30 years of living in Oregon. I almost missed the entry that changed everything. It was tucked between pages about wildflower identification and notes about seasonal bird migrations. But there it was, written in Naya's careful handwriting just 2 weeks before Celestine disappeared. Celestine asked about the old logging trails again. I told her about the school bus but warned her to stay away. Some places hold too much pain. My hands were shaking as I read those words. The school bus. I remembered the stories from when we were kids, whispered tales about a tragic accident back in the 80s. A school bus full of children that had gone off the mountain road during a storm. The driver had suffered a heart attack, they said, and couldn't control the vehicle as it careened through the guardrail and down into the ravine. 7 kids died that day, and the bus was never recovered because the terrain was too dangerous for heavy equipment. It had become one of those local legends that parents used to keep their children away from dangerous areas. "Don't go exploring. Those old logging roads," they'd warn. "That's where the ghost bus is, and kids who go looking for it don't come back." Typical small-town folklore designed to keep curious teenagers from getting lost in the wilderness. But Celestine had always been drawn to forbidden places. Even as a little girl, she'd been the one to suggest exploring the abandoned warehouse on the edge of town, or sneaking into the old cemetery after dark to look for supernatural activity. The more adults warned her away from something, the more determined she became to discover it for herself. And now I was sitting here, 3 years after her disappearance, holding proof that she'd been asking Naya about this particular forbidden place just days before she vanished. I stared at that journal entry for hours, reading it over and over until the words burned themselves into my memory. Every logical part of my brain told me I was grasping at straws, looking for connections that probably didn't exist. But my gut, the same instinct that had helped me solve dozens of cases through careful observation and evidence analysis, was screaming that this meant something important. The next morning, I called my cousin Bridger. He'd been working as a park ranger in the Millbrook Forest system for almost 10 years, and if anyone would know about old logging trails and abandoned vehicles, it would be him. We'd grown up together, practically siblings since our families, lived next door to each other, but we'd drifted apart after Celestine's disappearance. He'd been part of the original search parties, spending weeks combing through the forest looking for any trace of her. "Val, hey." His voice was cautious when he answered, "I heard you were back in town for Naya's estate. How are you holding up?" "Bridge, I need to ask you something, and I need you to give me a straight answer." I cut right to the point. "Do you know anything about an old school bus somewhere in the forest, from an accident back in the 80s? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed, become more serious. "Where did you hear about that?" "Naya's journal. She mentioned it to Celestine right before she disappeared." I could hear him taking a deep breath. "Bridge, please. I know it sounds crazy, but I think Celestine might have gone looking for it." "Vel, that's not a place you want to go poking around. The terrain up there is unstable, and there's a reason we don't advertise its location to hikers." He paused, and I could practically hear him weighing his options. "But if you really think it might be connected to Celestine, I guess I can't stop you from looking. At least if I'm with you, I can keep you from getting yourself killed." We agreed to meet at the ranger station early Saturday morning. I spent the rest of the week researching everything I could find about the 1987 accident. The newspaper archives painted a heartbreaking picture. A field trip gone horribly wrong when driver William Hensley suffered a massive heart attack while navigating a narrow mountain road during an unexpected storm. The bus had broken through a weakened section of guardrail and plummeted nearly 200 feet down a steep ravine. 7 children between the ages of 8 and 12 had died on impact. 3 others survived with serious injuries. The bus had been deemed impossible to retrieve due to the dangerous terrain and unstable rock formations in that area of the forest. The families had eventually held memorial services without recovering the bodies, and the whole area had been quietly closed to public access. Saturday morning came gray and drizzly, typical Oregon weather that made everything feel more ominous. Bridger was waiting for me at the station, already suited up in his hiking gear and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. He'd brought extra equipment for me, a proper backpack, hiking boots that actually fit, and a GPS device he insisted I carry. "Before we do this, I need you to understand what we're dealing with," he said as we loaded supplies into his truck. "The bus isn't just sitting there waiting to be explored like some tourist attraction. It's been rotting in that ravine for almost 40 years. The metal is corroded, the structure is unstable, and the whole area is prone to rock slides. If we find it, we look from a safe distance and then we leave. Understood?" I nodded. But we both knew I was lying. If there was any chance that bus held answers about what happened to Celestine, I wasn't going to be satisfied with looking from a distance. The drive to the trailhead took almost an hour, winding through increasingly remote forest roads until we reached a barely visible dirt track marked only by a small sign that read, "Authorized personnel only." Bridger had to use his ranger key to unlock a steel gate that blocked vehicle access. Beyond that point, we were on foot. The trail, if you could call it that, was more like an animal path that occasionally showed signs of human passage. Overgrown ferns reached chest-high in some places, and fallen logs created obstacles we had to climb over or crawl under. The further we hiked, the more I understood why this area had been closed to the public. One wrong step could send you tumbling down a slope that disappeared into fog and shadow. The original search parties never made it this far. Bridger explained as we stopped to catch our breath after a particularly steep climb. The access road washed out completely in the floods of '96, and by then everyone had given up hope of finding survivors. The Forest Service decided it was too dangerous to maintain trails in this section. But as we got deeper into the wilderness, I started noticing things that made my forensic training kick into high gear. Small signs that someone had passed this way recently. Broken branches at about shoulder height. Disturbed moss on rocks that would have been natural stepping stones. Most telling of all, a small piece of fabric caught on a thorn bush that made my heart stop when I saw it. "Bridger, look at this." I carefully extracted the fabric and held it up. It was a distinctive teal-blue cotton, soft and worn from many washings. "This is from a shirt Celestine had. I helped her pick it out for her 18th birthday. His expression grew grim as he examined the fabric. "This could be from anyone, Vel. That's a pretty common color." "No, look closer." I pointed to a small detail he'd missed. "See this tiny embroidered butterfly near the edge? Mom added that herself. She put little butterflies on all of Celestine's favorite clothes because she said they represented transformation and hope." We found more signs as we continued hiking. Fresh scratches on tree bark at the height where someone might steady themselves while climbing. Footprints in a muddy section near a stream crossing, partially washed away but still visible. And then, carved into the trunk of an old oak tree, something that made my blood run cold. CC, with a small butterfly drawn underneath. Celestine Chen. My sister had definitely been here, and recently enough that her mark hadn't been completely weathered away. She was here, Bridge. She actually found this place. My voice was shaking now, a mix of excitement and terror at what we might discover. "We have to keep going. Vel, this is getting dangerous. If Celestine was up here 3 years ago, anything could have happened. Rock slides, falls, wild animals. Maybe we should call this in and let a proper search and rescue team handle it." But before I could answer, we heard it. The sound of metal creaking in the wind, faint but unmistakable, carried up from somewhere in the ravine below us. We both froze, looking at each other with the same thought. We'd found it. Through a break in the trees, I could see a flash of yellow about 100 yards down the slope, partially hidden by decades of forest growth, but definitely man-made. The school bus was real, and it was exactly where Naya's journal had suggested it would be. "We're going down there," I said, already starting to pick my way carefully down the slope. "Vel, absolutely not. The ground is unstable, and we don't have proper climbing equipment. If something happens to you down there, I'll never be able to get help to you in time." I turned to face him, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt absolutely certain about something. My sister was 19 years old when she disappeared. She made this climb by herself, probably in worse weather than this, with no safety, equipment, and no backup plan. If she could do it, so can I. The look in my eyes must have convinced him that I was going with or without his help, because he sighed and started unpacking his rope. "Fine, but we do this my way, with proper safety precautions. And the minute I say we're leaving, we leave. No arguments." As we prepared for the descent, that metal creaking sound came again, carried on the wind like the ghost of children's laughter, or maybe like a warning. The descent took almost 30 minutes of careful climbing, with Bridger securing the rope around sturdy trees and checking every step before we committed our full weight. The closer we got to the bus, the more surreal the whole situation became. This massive yellow school bus, tilted at an impossible angle and partially embedded in the hillside, looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie. Moss and small trees had grown up around it, nature slowly reclaiming this monument to tragedy. "Jesus," Bridger whispered as we got close enough to see the full scope of the wreckage. I knew it was down here, but seeing it in person is something else entirely. The front of the bus had taken the worst impact, crumpled like an accordion against a massive boulder, but the back section, where we could see the emergency exit door hanging partially open, looked almost intact. Windows were blown out, and rust had eaten through much of the exterior, but the basic structure had held up better than I'd expected. My forensic training kicked in automatically. Before I even approached the bus, I pulled out my camera and started documenting everything. The angle of impact, the scatter pattern of debris, the way vegetation had grown around and through the wreckage. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. This was a potential crime scene, and I needed to preserve every detail. Wait, Bridger grabbed my arm as I started walking toward the rear door. Let me check the structural integrity first. This thing has been sitting here for 40 years. One wrong step, and the whole thing could shift. He was right to be cautious. The bus was resting on a precarious foundation of rocks and rotted logs, and I could see gaps underneath where the ground had washed away over the decades. But when he tested the rear section by gently pushing against the frame, it seemed stable enough to support our weight. It's holding, but we need to be careful about how we distribute our weight, he said. And if I say we're leaving immediately. No arguments. The rear emergency door was stuck, warped by decades of moisture and temperature changes. It took both of us pulling together to get it open enough to squeeze through. The sound it made, a tortured screech of metal on metal, echoed through the ravine like a scream. The smell hit me first. Musty, damp air mixed with something else I couldn't quite identify. Not death, thank God, but something organic and wrong. As my eyes adjusted to the dim interior, I understood why the bus had become local legend material. This wasn't just a crash site, it was a time capsule of horror. Faded children's backpacks were still scattered across the floor, their contents spilled and rotted beyond recognition. A lunchbox with cartoon characters I didn't recognize sat on one of the seats, its metal surface corroded but still somehow heartbreakingly innocent. Papers that might once have been homework assignments were scattered everywhere, the writing long since faded to illegibility. But there were other things too, things that didn't belong to 1987. Modern things. A sleeping bag, damp but not ancient, was spread across several seats in the back section. Next to it, an empty water bottle with a brand label I recognized from current grocery store shelves. A small camp stove, the kind hikers use, tucked neatly under one of the seats. And most shocking of all, a battery-powered lantern that still had juice when I tested the switch. Someone's been living here, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Recently. Bridger was examining the sleeping bag, careful not to disturb it too much. This gear is maybe a few years old at most. The fabric isn't degraded enough to have been here much longer than that. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every instinct told me I was about to find something that would change everything I thought I knew about Celestine's disappearance. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, scanning every corner of the bus with methodical precision. That's when I found it. Tucked between the sleeping bag and the side of the bus, partially hidden under what looked like a makeshift pillow, was something that made the world stop spinning for a moment. A turquoise bracelet, handmade with distinctive silver beads, exactly like the one Naya had given Celestine for her 16th birthday. "Bridge!" my voice cracked as I called him over. "Look at this." He examined the bracelet without touching it, recognizing it immediately. He'd been there the day Naya gave it to her, had helped her pick out the perfect beads from the craft store downtown. That's definitely Celestine's. She never took that thing off. But the bracelet wasn't the only personal item I found. Carefully, wrapped in a plastic bag and tucked under the makeshift bedding, was a small notebook, the kind Celestine always carried for sketching and writing. The pages were damp but still readable, and when I opened it to the first entry, I saw her familiar handwriting staring back at me. Bridge, she was here. Celestine was definitely here, and she was here for a while. I flipped through the pages, seeing entries dated over several weeks. Look at this. The first entry is from 2 months before she disappeared. The early entries were exactly what I'd expect from Celestine. Descriptions of her hikes to reach the bus, sketches of the surrounding forest, even some pressed flowers tucked between pages. She wrote about feeling peaceful here, away from everyone's worried looks and constant questions about her mental health. She described the bus as her sanctuary of understanding, a place where she could sit with tragedy and not feel obligated to pretend everything was okay. But as I read further, the tone began to change. The entries became less about seeking solitude and more about seeking answers. She started writing about other missing people, young adults who had disappeared from surrounding counties over the past few years. She'd done research, made lists, even included printouts of missing person flyers that she'd somehow managed to bring up here. She was investigating something, I told Bridger, my excitement building. Look at all these names, all these cases. She wasn't just hiding up here, she was working on something. The entries revealed a pattern that made my blood run cold. All the missing people were between 18 and 25. All had histories of mental health struggles. All had been dismissed by local law enforcement as probable runaways or suicide cases. And all had disappeared from small towns within a 100-mile radius of Millbrook. But the most chilling part was Celestine's growing paranoia in the later entries. She started writing about feeling watched during her hikes to the bus. She mentioned seeing the same vehicle parked at different trailheads on multiple occasions. She wrote about someone asking questions about her in town, someone who claimed to be researching missing persons cases for a true crime podcast. Someone was hunting her, I realized, the full horror of the situation hitting me. She figured out there was a pattern to these disappearances, and whoever was behind it knew she was getting too close. The final entry was dated exactly 1 week before Celestine disappeared. Her handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. I know who it is now. I have proof, pictures, everything I need to expose him. But he knows I'm onto him. I can feel it. If something happens to me, I'm leaving. Everything here. Someone will find it eventually. Someone will finish what I started. But as I flipped to the back of the notebook, looking for this evidence she mentioned, I found something that made my hands shake. A thick manila envelope, wrapped in multiple plastic bags to keep it dry, taped to the inside back cover of the notebook, and written on the envelope in Celestine's careful block letters. For Valora, I knew you'd be the one to find this. She knew, I whispered, tears starting to blur my vision. She knew I'd eventually come looking for her, and she left all of this for me to find. Bridger was looking over my shoulder as I carefully opened the envelope. Inside were dozens of photographs printed from a digital camera. Photos of missing person flyers, just like Celestine had described. But also surveillance photos, taken from a distance, of a man in uniform talking to young people in various locations around the county. And then, in the very last photograph, a clear shot of the man's face as he turned toward the camera. Someone Celestine had apparently photographed without his knowledge, someone who looked directly familiar because I'd seen him many times over the past 3 years. Deputy Marshal Quentin Reeves, the same officer who had worked Celestine's missing person case, the same man who had assured our family that everything possible was being done to find her, the same person who had convinced us that Celestine had most likely run away and would come home when she was ready. The same man who, according to Celestine's final note tucked behind the photographs, had been systematically targeting and killing vulnerable young adults for years, making their disappearances look like suicides or voluntary disappearances. And judging by the detailed timeline Celestine had created, she had figured this out exactly 1 week before she became his final victim. I was staring at Deputy Reeves's photograph, my mind reeling from the implications, when I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps, heavy boots crunching on the rocky ground outside the bus, moving with purpose and getting closer. Bridger heard it too. His hand immediately went to his radio, but I grabbed his wrist before he could key it. Something about those footsteps felt wrong, too deliberate, like someone who knew exactly where they were going. In a forest this remote, there should be no one else here. No one except someone who had been watching us, following us, waiting for us to lead them to exactly what we'd just found. Bridger, Valora. A familiar voice called out from somewhere near the front of the bus. I know you're in there. Why don't you come out so we can talk about this like civilized people? Deputy Marshal Quentin Reeves, the man whose photograph I was still holding in my trembling hands, the man who had sat in our living room 3 years ago, drinking my mother's coffee, and assuring us that everything possible was being done to find Celestine. The man who had looked me in the eye at Naya's funeral just weeks ago and told me how sorry he still was for our loss. Bridger's face had gone completely white. He knew, just as I did, that there was no innocent explanation for Reeves being here. This wasn't a coincidence or a routine patrol. He had followed us, which meant he knew we were getting close to something he couldn't let us discover. "What do we do?" Bridger whispered, his ranger training warring with the panic I could see building in his eyes. I forced myself to think like the forensic investigator I was trained to be. We were trapped in an unstable bus at the bottom of a ravine, with only one exit, facing someone who had already killed at least half a dozen people and had nothing left to lose. But we had advantages too. We had Celestine's evidence, and we had the high ground of knowledge. He didn't know yet exactly what we'd found. "We need to get this evidence out of here," I whispered back, quickly stuffing the photographs and notebook into my backpack. "If something happens to us, at least someone else might eventually find the truth." "Come on, you two," Reeves called. Again, and I could hear him moving around the outside of the bus, probably looking for the best vantage point. "I'm not going to hurt anyone. I just want to talk about what you think you've discovered up here." The casual tone of his voice was somehow more terrifying than if he'd been shouting threats. This was a man who was comfortable with violence, who had probably used that same calm, reasonable voice to lure his other victims into situations where they couldn't escape. Bridger was fumbling with his radio again, trying to get a signal to call for backup, but the ravine was too deep and the forest too thick. We were completely cut off from outside help. Whatever happened next, we were on our own. "I know what you're thinking," Reeves continued, and I could tell he was getting closer to the rear entrance. "You're wondering how I knew you were here, wondering if I followed you from town. The truth is, I've been keeping an eye on this place for years. Your sister wasn't the only one who thought she could use it as a base of operations. That's when it hit me. The sick realization that made everything click into place. He's been coming here regularly," I whispered to Bridger. "He's been monitoring the bus, probably removing evidence, making sure nobody else discovered what Celestine left behind. Smart girl, just like your sister," Reeves said, apparently close enough now to hear our whispered conversation. "Celestine was brilliant, you know. Too brilliant for her own good. She figured out patterns that took me years to perfect. She connected dots that most law enforcement agencies never even looked for. I could see his shadow now, moving past one of the broken windows. He was just outside the bus, close enough that I could hear the leather of his duty belt creaking as he moved. Close enough that any attempt to run would be suicide. The thing about small-town police work," he continued conversationally, "is that people want simple explanations for complicated problems. Troubled kid goes missing. Must be a runaway. College student with depression disappears. Probably suicide. Nobody wants to believe that someone they trust, someone whose job is to protect and serve, might be the real threat." Bridger was slowly moving toward the emergency exit, trying to position himself between me and where he thought Reeves would appear. But I realized with growing horror that Reeves was hurting us, using his voice to keep our attention focused on one area while he moved to cut off our only escape route. "I've been doing this for 8 years, Reeves said, and now his voice was coming from a different direction entirely. 8 years of cleaning up society's mistakes. These kids, they were already lost, already broken. I just helped them find a permanent solution to their problems. You murdered them," I called out, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "You murdered vulnerable people who trusted you to help them." "I provided a service," he replied, and for the first time there was real emotion in his voice. Anger, but also something that sounded almost like pride. "You know how many resources these people drain? How much pain they cause their families? I was doing everyone a favor. That's when I saw him. Not where his voice was coming from, but reflected in a piece of broken mirror that had somehow survived the crash. He was crouched near the front of the bus, partially hidden by the crumpled metal, with a clear shot at the emergency exit. If we tried to run, we'd be completely exposed. But as I watched his reflection, I noticed something that gave me hope. He was alone. Whatever his plan was, he was executing it solo, which meant he was probably improvising. He hadn't expected us to find the evidence, hadn't prepared for this specific scenario. The beauty of my method, he continued, still talking like this was a normal conversation, was that I never had to force anyone to come with me. They trusted me. Badge, uniform, official vehicle. When Deputy Reeves offered to give you a ride home, or suggested a nice quiet place where you could talk through your problems, you didn't question it. I was frantically looking around the interior of the bus, searching for anything we could use as a weapon or a distraction. The camp stove Celestine had left behind caught my eye. It was a small propane model, and if the tank still had fuel in it might create enough of an explosion to give us a chance to escape. Celestine figured it out because she was spending so much time researching missing persons cases, Reeves said, and now I could hear him moving again, getting closer to our position. She started noticing that I was the responding officer on more disappearances than statistical probability would suggest. Smart girl. Too smart. What did you do to her? I demanded, buying time while I quietly unscrewed the connection between the stove and the propane tank. Same thing I did to all of them. Same thing I'm going to have to do to you. His voice was right outside the emergency exit now. The difference is, your sister accepted her fate with dignity. She understood that she was part of something larger than herself. The propane hissed softly as I loosened the connection, and I prayed he couldn't hear it over his own voice. Bridger caught my eye and nodded slightly, understanding what I was planning without needing an explanation. You see, the problem with you, Valora, is that you're not broken like the others were. You're functional, successful, stable. Killing you is going to require a different approach. More creative staging. That's when he stepped into view at the emergency exit, service weapon drawn, but held casually at his side. He looked exactly like he always had. Clean-cut, professional, the picture of small-town law enforcement competence. Except for his eyes, which held something cold and predatory that I'd never noticed before. But first, I need to know exactly what evidence you found in here, so I can make sure it disappears permanently along with you. I held up the propane tank, my thumb on the valve release. One more step and I flood this bus with gas and ignite it with the lantern. We all die. But your secret dies with us, and eventually someone else will figure out what you've been doing. The first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. This wasn't going according to whatever plan he'd made. You wouldn't do that, he said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. You're not suicidal like your sister was. My sister wasn't suicidal. I snarled, my finger tightening on the valve. She was murdered by a coward who preyed on people who couldn't fight back. But I'm not broken, remember? I'm functional and stable, which means I'm exactly crazy enough to take you with me if that's what it takes to stop you. That's when Bridger made his move. Bridger launched himself at Reeves from the side, using his ranger training and knowledge of the terrain to his advantage. While Reeves was focused on me and the threat of the propane tank, Bridger had quietly positioned himself near a gap in the bus wall where he could attack from an unexpected angle. The tackle sent both men tumbling down the rocky slope, away from the bus and away from me. I didn't hesitate. The moment they were clear, I released the propane valve and threw the tank as hard as I could toward the front of the bus, then grabbed the battery-powered lantern and hurled it after the tank. The small explosion that followed wasn't Hollywood spectacular, but it was enough to create a wall of flame between me and where Reeves might try to return. More importantly, it created a signal that could be seen for miles. Black smoke rising from the forest would bring every ranger, firefighter, and emergency responder in the county to this location. Whatever happened next, we wouldn't be alone much longer. I scrambled out of the bus with Celestine's evidence clutched against my chest and found Bridger and Reeves locked in a desperate struggle about 50 feet down the slope. Bridger was younger and in better shape. But Reeves was fighting with the desperation of someone who knew his life was over, if he was captured alive. That's when I remembered my forensic training about crime scene preservation and evidence collection. Instead of rushing into the fight, I used those precious seconds to document everything. Photos of Reeves, photos of the struggle, photos of the bus and the evidence we'd found. If something happened to us, at least there would be a digital record of what we'd discovered. The sound of helicopters reached us about 10 minutes later. The smoke from the bus fire had indeed brought a massive emergency response, and within an hour the ravine was swarming with state police, federal agents, and search and rescue teams. Reeves was in custody, bloodied and defeated, while Bridger was being treated by paramedics for cuts and bruises, but otherwise unharmed. The investigation that followed was the most extensive criminal probe in our county's history. Celestine's evidence led to the discovery of 11 victims over 8 years, all young adults between 18 and 25 who had been dismissed as runaways or suicides. Reeves had used his position as a deputy marshal to gain their trust, then murdered them in remote locations where their bodies might never be found. But the most devastating revelation came during his confession. Celestine hadn't died immediately. Reeves had kept her prisoner for almost 2 weeks, trying to break her psychologically before killing her, because she was the first victim who had actually figured out his pattern. He wanted to understand how she'd connected the dots that had eluded trained investigators. She had refused to give up the location of her evidence cache, even under extreme duress. She died protecting the information that would eventually bring him to justice, never knowing that her sister would be the one to find it and finish what she'd started. The hardest part for our family was learning that we'd been right all along. Celestine hadn't run away. She hadn't given up on life. She had been murdered by someone we trusted, someone who had looked us in the eye and lied about his efforts to find her while knowing exactly where her body was buried. But there was also something profoundly meaningful about discovering what she'd been doing in those final months. My sister hadn't been hiding in that bus because she was broken or defeated. She'd been working, investigating, building a case against a predator who was targeting people like her. She had transformed her own pain and vulnerability into a weapon against someone who preyed on the vulnerable. The Celestine Chen Foundation, which I established 6 months after Reeves's conviction, focuses on missing persons cases that law enforcement agencies are quick to classify as runaways or voluntary disappearances. We've helped solve 7 cases in the past 2 years, all involving young adults whose families were told their loved ones had simply chosen to disappear. Our work has revealed a pattern that makes me sick to think about: how easy it is for predators in positions of authority to exploit vulnerable young people, and how readily our systems dismiss these disappearances when the victims don't fit the profile of an ideal victim. Celestine's case opened doors to investigations in 3 other states, leading to the discovery of similar patterns and additional arrests. I still have Naya's hiking journal, and I still wear Celestine's turquoise bracelet every day, not as symbols of loss, but as reminders of the love that connected 3 generations of women who refused to accept easy answers when something felt wrong. Naya's careful documentation led me to Celestine's evidence cache. Celestine's courage and intelligence brought down a serial killer, and somehow, despite everything, their love reached across death to make sure the truth finally came out. The abandoned school bus has been removed from the forest now, along with the remains of the children who died there in 1987. All of them finally got proper burials, and the families got closure they'd been denied for 40 years. The site has been turned into a memorial garden, with a plaque honoring both the original victims and the young woman who used their tragedy as a sanctuary while fighting her own battle against evil. I visit that memorial several times a year, usually on Celestine's birthday and on the anniversary of the day we found her evidence. I tell her about the cases we've solved, about the families who finally got answers because of the foundation she inadvertently inspired. I tell her that she was right about Deputy Reeves, right about the pattern of disappearances, and most importantly, right to trust that someone would eventually find what she'd left behind. The last thing I always tell her is that she was never broken, never a burden, never anything less than a hero who died protecting other people from a monster. She just learned to channel her darkness into light for others, and that light is still shining today through every case we solve and every family we help find closure. Mental health struggles don't define a person's worth or limit their capacity for courage. Depression and trauma don't make someone weak or disposable. Sometimes the people who seem most lost are actually the ones fighting hardest to help others find their way. Celestine taught me that the most powerful thing you can do with your pain is use it to recognize and respond to someone else's. If this story moved you or made you think differently about missing persons cases, I'd appreciate it if you'd like this video and subscribe to my channel. I share stories from our foundation's work every month, highlighting cases where families refused to accept simple explanations and fought for the truth about their missing loved ones. Your support helps us continue this work and reach more people who might be facing similar situations. Remember, if someone you love goes missing, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, keep asking questions. Keep demanding answers. Keep fighting for the truth, even when authorities tell you to accept easy explanations. Because sometimes the person you're looking for is still fighting too, in ways you might not expect, and they're counting on someone who loves them to never give up. The abandoned school bus in the woods held more secrets than anyone could have imagined. But the most important secret was that love doesn't disappear just because someone does. Sometimes it transforms into something stronger, something that can reach across time and death to make sure the truth finally comes to light.